One aspect of Japanese media that I find interesting is seeing how it portrays death in the afterlife, and how that depiction compares to those in Western culture. Sometimes unconventional approaches, such as mixing humor and romance with themes of death, can highlight those differences and similarities in unique ways. Death and comedy aren't ideas that usually go hand in hand, but that sort of narrative juxtaposition can be the fruit of something much greater than the sum of its parts. This is the main gist of today's game, a visual novel released in 2006 by Palette, now better known for the 9-9 series and Mashiro Iroh's Symphony, although one could say that this was the title that truly put them on the map. Hey there, this is Marin, and this is my review of Moshimo Ashita Hare Naraba. The story begins 10 years in the past, when the protagonist, Hatoba Kazuki, meets the Nonosaki sisters. Their uncle, Kazuki's father, took them in as foster children after they both lost their parents in a traffic accident. The sisters, Akiho and Tsubasa, were first bashful in their new environment, but quickly opened up and formed a close bond with Kazuki. Years went by, and Kazuki finally mustered the courage to confess his feelings to the older sister, Akiho, who promptly reciprocated them. Their happiness was, however, short-lived. Soon after their romantic phase started, Akiho fell ill and abruptly passed away. This left Kazuki and the little sister, Tsubasa, in a state of shock, unable to accept the sudden loss of their loved one. Weeks passed, and with summer nearing its end, Kazuki began noticing peculiar occurrences. He starts seeing a faint figure of Akiho appearing and floating around him. As it turns out, those were not mere delusions. Akiho had returned, but as an ethereal ghost. The game certainly has an interesting premise, and I feel that for the most part, it does it justice. The common route is structured in chapters, each one focusing primarily on one of the main girls. I appreciated how well-defined each chapter was, with clear narrative arcs and effective presentations of the conflicts that would be further explored during the individual character routes. It was also quite cute how, after finishing one chapter, the game would show you a preview of the upcoming one, narrated by the characters, resembling something you would see in an anime show. They did, however, occasionally reveal a bit too much and felt somewhat spoilery, but even then, I still thought they were a nice addition. One noteworthy aspect of the common route is how absolutely fantastic the first chapter is. It's no exaggeration to say that this is where the game truly peaks. The slow build-up to the revelation that Akiho was still around was handled exceptionally well, with a gradual and subtle increase of her presence in Kazuki's everyday life. Moreover, while the chapter focused on Akiho, it also nicely introduced hints of other characters' struggles, which would later on be picked up. The conclusion of this chapter was also incredibly effective and powerful, delivering perhaps the most emotional scene in the entire game. I genuinely believe that you could rearrange this whole chapter, maybe add a scene or two here and there, and repackage it as a smaller narrative, and it would become one of the best short visual novels ever made. It is unfortunate that the story never reaches the highs of this chapter, but it's not like the dip in quality is that pronounced. The rest of the common route was engaging as well, with a nice sense of pacing and occasional emotional moments. It does at times feel like the game gravitates towards being a generic moj, which is somewhat disappointing since I believe the game is at its best when exploring the characters' points of view regarding death. There's, however, one elephant in the room that needs to be mentioned, which is the relationship between Kazuki and Akiho. As mentioned in the game's summary, the two of them began a boyfriend-girlfriend relationship just before Akiho's passing, and it's their intention to continue it now that they are reunited. The problem is that the romanticism between the two isn't that well conveyed throughout this common route. Their interactions often feel more like those of close friends than lovers. This issue is also highlighted by Kazuki's general behavior. His overly easygoing and indecisive nature makes him easily swayed by any girl who acts remotely cute or flirtatious towards him. In a way, Akiho is also guilty of this. She's apparently perfectly okay with Kazuki seeing other girls, although in her case this is more understandable considering her ephemeral circumstances. Additionally, there's one chapter that feels like it's fan service for the sake of fan service. As a result, not only does it feel slightly out of place, but it also emphasizes that sense of detachment in their relationship. I can understand that this sort of content is the bread and butter of this medium, but there surely could have been a better way to incorporate it. Before moving on to the individual character roots, I also want to touch on the cast and their group dynamics. Like many moeg, the game features 4 main characters. The 2 sisters, Tamami, who is a classmate and close friend of Tsubasa, and Chihaya, another ghostly character. Out of the bunch, Akiho was my personal favorite. Despite she, well, being dead, she was remarkably lively, with a great sense of humor, but at the same time she displayed a nice range of emotions, accentuated by the outstanding performance of her voice actress. Her little sister Tsubasa is a character that I think could have been insufferable, but in my opinion, she was quite well written, with a compelling and nuanced inner conflict. Tamami fulfills the tsundere role, but at the same time, she showed a nice development as a character. It's probably worth noting that she spoke using a Kansai dialect, which, by the way, can we have more Kansai dialect-speaking heroines, please? That intonation is like honey to my ears. Anyway, as for Chihaya, the other supernatural character alongside Akiho, I felt, however, like her personality slightly overlapped with Tsubasa's, since Chihaya too had a meek and docile demeanor, resembling a little sister character as well. As a result, there were portions of the story where I felt like the chemistry of the group wasn't contrasting enough. It was only once Tamami had a bigger presence in the narrative that things began to balance out. Regarding the character routes, I thought they were kind of hit or miss. If I'm being honest, I didn't particularly enjoy Akiho's route. While the main conflict had an appropriate sense of urgency, it was something so frequently brought up during the common route that it did lose some of its impact. The protagonist's actions were also difficult to accept at face value. The problem lies in the fact that the drama between the 2 characters originated from the protagonist's indecisiveness, and as a result, it was more aggravating than anything. Also, without delving into spoilers, while I wouldn't say that her ending was by any means bad, I thought it was quite predictable. Not so long ago, I played another visual novel with a ghost heroine, and the ending was quite literally identical. I know it's unfair to blame the game for this, but I was hoping for a more unique conclusion. Tsubasa's route was perhaps the most interesting one, but also not without its flaws. Once again, the kickstart of the drama was fueled by the protagonist's ambivalent attitude. That being said, Tsubasa's inner conflict of wanting to be with Kazuki, but at the same time not wanting to betray her older sister, was quite compelling. There were a couple of scenes told from Tsubasa's perspective that were vital to properly express this personal dilemma of hers. On the flip side, the way she decided to deal with it was somewhat frustrating. Ultimately, the enjoyment of this route comes down entirely to your willingness to accept a character who is rather clumsy at handling their emotions. The ending was quite good though, probably the best one in my opinion. As for Tamami and Chihaya's routes, I felt similarly about both. To me, both of them lacked a certain commitment to deal with heavier and more complex themes. In the case of Tamami, I thought her close friend Tsubasa was going to have a bigger role, considering that she too harbored feelings towards the protagonist. There was one particular scene that hinted at the love triangle becoming far more prominent, but ultimately it led nowhere. In the case of Chihaya's route, I thought the protagonist's mixed feelings towards her was an intriguing narrative angle. And while it's not like they went completely unaddressed, I just couldn't shake the feeling that there was a lot more room for exploration there. In my opinion, this was the game's biggest flaw. I felt like the game was somewhat shackled by its moog nature. There was a noticeable reluctancy to explore darker, more complex ideas, settling instead for a kinder, gentler approach. The character's tendency to forgive so readily prevented the story from developing richer, more thought-provoking dynamics. It's not my goal to impose my own tastes and criticize this game for something that it isn't, but considering that death is a main topic in this story, I'm not sure a mellowed-out and overly wholesome narrative direction was the right approach here. What's frustrating is that it did occasionally step into that territory, but it just as quickly pulled back. Nevertheless, I do want to make clear that the game has its fair share of strong moments. As mentioned, the first chapter was fantastic, and there were other emotional scenes sprinkled here and there. It's just that the potential for an incredible experience was right there, but the game never reached out to seize it. On a final note, be aware that the Moeg Kersey strikes again. I personally like the class rep more than the majority of the main cast, but alas, no root. She did technically get an ending, but the game had the nerve to treat it as a bad ending. Unforgivable. The presentation of this game is one aspect that's really hard to find fault with. The art style looks extremely smooth with plenty of little details, such as the sprite of Ghost Akiho dimly glowing in the night, the leaves of the trees in the background changing color between summer and autumn, or the occasional camera pan or zoom in. I particularly liked whenever they applied small animations to the sprites, like a burning effect in their eyes. The audio department was just as strong. It made clever use of stereo audio for both voices and sound effects, which, while simple, effectively created a great sense of immersion. I also appreciated how it included spoken lines in the background. I think that sort of touch always adds to the atmosphere. The music itself was excellent too. It had a handful of instrumental tracks, as in tracks that used actual real instruments, which sounded great, but even the regular tracks were of high quality. Plus, the game very effectively used vocal songs in important scenes, which nicely accentuated their emotional impact. As I said, I think the presentation is basically flawless. I think the only complaint I can remotely think of is that you can't skip the chapter preview segments, although I'm basically splitting hairs here.
まとめ
To conclude, Moshimo Ashita ga Hare Naraba is a visual novel that was very close to greatness, but in the end, it was simply good, which is obviously not a bad thing, but it's slightly disappointing considering how much potential it first showed. The earlier hours of the story were stellar, presenting captivating ideas and dealing with weighty topics. It is unfortunate that it never went too far with them, only treating those themes on a surface level. On the other hand, it still provides an enjoyable time supported by its excellent presentation. It might not be at the top of the visual novel echelon, but I think it still delivers a fun time overall. I give Moshimo Ashita ga Hare Naraba a 7.5 out of 10. And that's going to be it for the review. While the game left me slightly disappointed, I didn't want to lower the score too much, mostly because that first chapter was so damn good. By the way, you can play that entire part for free since that's the content of the game's demo, as far as I know. Something else I didn't mention is that I felt like the Japanese level required for this one wasn't that high, so maybe check it out if you want to read something that's easy but also decent. Anyway, as always, thanks for watching. Marin out.